back at the USM library. I feel the need to not raise my voice too much because I am in the study room that is, I think that it's more or less soundproof here, but it's awfully quiet. It's been a while since I've been in this space. Must have been, I want to say early March, late February. And perhaps it would be better if I had the background behind me as Greater Portland, more or less. Actually, this is called Baxter Boulevard, and the water behind me is the Back Cove. And once again, I'm silhouetted here as I did in Albuquerque. So, right. So this is the work that was written 10 years ago today, April the 7th, 2004, and today is April the 7th, 2014. Yesterday's meditation was short, and as I said in my post-reading commentary, that had to do with the fact that at this point in the writing, I was moving slowly through the allegory of the cave, and on the 6th of April, I articulated a question which had to do with the preparation for receiving the call. So in the allegory of the cave, there's a cave dweller, a prisoner who is liberated, and then the question was that I posed is, in what sense were they ready to receive the call that put them underway? In what sense were they able to hear the call that drew them away from what they were doing, the habit of participating with the other members of their demos in the perception and discussion of the shadows on the wall? Is there something that enabled them to hear the call? So it wasn't so the emphasis then of the question that I raised yesterday, and that I'm going to be exploring further, had to do with the emphasis on the cave dweller, the then prisoner in the cave, the one who's in chains, being prepared so that their emancipation, the power of the force of that emancipation isn't coming solely from the one who is liberating them, right? But in fact is coming from them as well. Perhaps more importantly, is coming from them. So the question is whether or not they were in their capacity, rather, were they prepared to receive the call? That is to say, was that capacity that Plato talks about, that each and every one of us has for thinking, what he calls for knowing the truth, is that capacity something that is already sort of activated, such that when we hear the call to learning, we are able to receive it? So that's the question, and that's what I introduced yesterday, and that's what I'm picking up. And I concluded the meditation by saying that if we go back to the first part of the allegory, we may find a way of understanding this modality of preparation or of preparedness in the very beginning of the story, in the modality of bondage and delusion. So that's where I'm picking it up. How is it that the state of bondage, of being chained by the neck and feet, can be said to prepare us to hear the call of learning? The power of the metaphor of bondage within the story lies in its capacity to reveal the status of ignorance as complete unfreedom. The prisoners are living within a state of unfreedom because they have no perspective of the conditions they are living in. They have a non-perspective. The impositional and prefabricated quality of these conditions will be taken up momentarily. and then we will take up the question concerning the identity and modality of those responsible for maintaining this confinement. For the moment, we focus on the unilateral nature of the experience, of living within the strict confines of a single cell or chamber. To describe an experience as unilateral is to emphasize the strict singularity of the location. Unilateral, single location. But the term is also closely linked to a term that would denote a strictly singular perspective or manner of seeing. Thus, unilateral has a familiar resemblance to unilateral, a term we can construct to represent a singular gaze or way of seeing. The life of ignorance, of unfreedom, which emerges in the first part of the story as the dominant mode of being, is both unilateral and unacular. The term we might use today to describe the one-sided, confined state of unfreedom, which brings together lacular and ocular, is unilateralism. The condition of being chained and thereby being forced to remain sitting and staring forward is meant to depict the enforcement of ignorance that follows from the modality of unfreedom. The being of unfreedom is the position of the way of the unilateralist. Unilateralism denotes the state of being unilateral. Unilateral describes the singular vision or position of a singular being, the very singularity of a one-sided perspective. Thus, it is, quote, relating to or involving one side, done, made, undertaken, or shared by one of two or more persons or parties, dealing with or affecting one side of a subject, unquote, from a dictionary. Thus, a group, as much as an individual, can maintain a unilateral mode of being. To be unilateral is to be limited in the most constrained form possible. For to take or produce a singular vision is to have a final and uncompromising vision. It is the pure state of unfreedom, and thereby more severe than having no perspective, which may better describe the modality of ignorance we identify with the prisoners in the tale. Although we might describe their condition as unilateral, because it appears to be confined within the strict limits of the cave, unilateral, and limited to one view of the cave, unacular, their modality might better be described as one of unilaterality, physical one-sidedness. Hey Jay, can I call you back? Yeah. Okay. That was my colleague Jason Wozniak. So unilaterality, physical one-sidedness. They are physically unable to see about them, to take multiple perspectives, and thus they cannot be said to have chosen to take a unilateral position, at least not in the first part of the story that we are now revisiting. As the story gets underway, we find the prisoners chattering on about the shadows appearing on the wall before them with absolutely no sense of the shadowness of the shadows, the illusionary nature of the only images offered to them. They have no perspective because they have no sense of an alternative. They have not chosen to take up this position, so we cannot identify their perspective as a location they have chosen to take up. As we've already suggested, the capacity to be turned around to receive the call to learn is closely linked to the capacity to respond. To respond is to receive the call, the gift of teachability. But to receive this gift is to not refuse it. This means the apprentice is one who decided against refusing to be closed. To receive the gift is to choose openness. But the ones who are kept in bondage are not offered the gift to accept or refuse, and thereby have no perspective. They are oppressed, kept in a state of physical one-sidedness. Indeed, it is only in the fourth and final part of the story that they as a group are offered the gift. Here in part one, then, the ones who are truly unilateral are those who have taken up the one-sided location, who have chosen to live and be with the unilocular and to perceive in the uniocular manner. Those who have taken up the modality of unfreedom are those who produce the theater of delusion and oppression. And that's how it ends. So, it's a strange but not unlikely or unusual meditation that I wrote on the 7th of April, this day, 10 years ago. And that's because the context, the historical context, was the regime of George Bush II, his presidency, and the ongoing war, so-called war on terror. Unilateralism, then, as the theme that gets taken up in this meditation, has to be understood as coming out of that time. And I was also attempting to map that zeitgeist of unilateralism onto an understanding of contemporary education, the expectations placed upon educators in schools and then increasingly so in colleges and universities. So unilateralism then represents the logic of high stakes testing, the logic of what's called performativity, of accountability, and all the mechanisms at work to ensure that students are more or less learning or being taught in the same way, or looking forward in the same manner. And this, of course, is captured most intensely by the policy at the federal education level, the federal policy of no child left behind. So playing with this title of this policy, this national policy of no child left behind, and perhaps somewhat cynically understanding that in the sense of always looking forward, but not in an emancipatory way, but in precisely the way that is depicted by Plato in the allegory of the cave. So what I'm calling attention to in the end is the power dynamic that has put into place a kind of unilateralism in educational policy and the expectations coming from that policy with regard to what's demanded and expected both from teachers and students. Now, how that takes up the question of preparation remains to be seen. I clearly got off track, so to speak, but what I did was, by following in the phenomenological manner, I went from the sentence, the prisoners are living within a state of unfreedom because they have no perspective of the conditions they are living in. They have a non-perspective, to then continue writing, following that thought, and arriving at the conclusion that they have, in their state of being, neither the capacity, or apparently they do not have the capacity to receive or refuse the gift of teachability. So my first attempt at trying to take up this question, the question concerning being prepared to receive the call of learning, is to say, in the state that these cave dwellers are in, it seems that they are not in a condition at all to be able to receive or refuse the gift that's being offered to them. Now that in some ways doesn't answer the question, because the question is saying it's not so much whether or not they're prepared to receive the gift, but whether or not they're prepared to hear the call. And receiving the gift and hearing the call are slightly different things. But the overlap happens because I'm suggesting that they have no perspective. They don't recognize these prisoners, these cave dwellers, that they're in a cave. They have no sense of their being, having been placed there or being restrained there. They have no perspective. They have no knowledge of the whole mechanism and the theater of delusion that they are in. This is their reality, and they have no sense of, they have no perspective, other than the perspective of looking forward. So they're placed into, if you will, and conditioned by unilateralism. But those who are orchestrating the theater, they most certainly are aware of what's going on and are the ones, in fact, of course, that are staging and orchestrating the whole event. So in a way, the initial answer is to say that the cave dwellers, there is no sense of being prepared, because the offering that's made through the call, if we want to collapse the two, the offering that's made by the call to learning, which is when heard, the first moment and the first and key moment, the originary moment that turns the prisoner around, right? Breaks the chains, compels him to get up, and turns him around. That first moment of paideia is crucial. Everything after that becomes a repetition of that initial and originary moment. So as a first kind of response to the question, it appears as if one isn't prepared, especially or specially, to receive the call of learning, so that in a certain sense, it seems that one of them was called. And initially, this seems to be the case. One of them was called. And so that the power seems to reside in the caller, in the one who bears the message and delivers the call. So that's where I'm going to leave it until tomorrow.